So my name's Kevin Nassery, and at the end of the last talk, I think we really started to have some great question back and forth about kind of the dichotomy between what us as I think a lot of us in this room kind of describe themselves as technologists and people who love kind of the nuts and bolts of technology, and that's why we got into it as a hobby into career transition, which I definitely put myself in that category. And how do we kind of expend that influence on the business without necessarily making it a head-butting challenge? And I spent so far 11 years of my career where I was the go-to guy to solve problems. But if something was broke and it rhymed with Nix or ISCO, I was the guy they put in the room to fix it.
That's the one that's picking you up.
Okay. I was the one that they put in the room to fix the issue. I would walk into a cage, early on as a network engineer for Exodus and professional services with, 40 devices just sitting in a cage, and I'd walk out and there would be a working network, whether or not going into the cage I knew how any of it worked, or not. So, I grew up solving problems, and that's kind of how I made, the first 6 years of my career successful. And then I kind of stopped, and I stopped kind of growing in the sense where I would still love to grow technically, but from a career-wise, I kind of stalled there for a couple years. So what this talk is kind of, I figured out, I think, a lot of it last year as to why I stopped. And so I'm going to get into, basically, if I could go back in time 5 years ago and narrowly avoid sleeping with my own mother. This is the slide deck that I would give to myself in order to try to avoid some of these challenges that I've been faced on. So, I've seen a lot of security talks, and the last thing I would want to do in this day and age is come to a security talk without hard data. So, although embarrassing, I have taken, I had a 360 review last year as part of a program at the company I was at for more than 5 years, and probably 5 out of the 10 people that filled it out I had worked with in even past careers. So I have data from probably 10 of my closest colleagues over the last 10 years on what I was doing wrong. And we'll go over some of that. The targeted at people who excel with technology and problem solving. So here I am, as far as knowing my audience, I think all of us in this room love the technology aspect of it. Some of us can deal with the business aspects and some of us can't. So, I think we've heard a lot of the challenges dealing with social issues and stuff like that. So here I am knowing my audience, and yet I'm going to proceed to give you this kind of soft talk that really has nothing to do with the technology problems at all, just really evolving from my last 10 years of failures. Now, that being said, although I failed a lot in the last 10 years, if any prospective clients or employers are watching this on YouTube when I submitted my resume to you, you want a guy who's kind of recognizes at least that he missed that. Now, the corrective action and course correction that I've taken, I think it's working for me now, and that's why I sat to share this data. I know that everybody likes to think, we're unique. I figure worst case, if nobody in this room applies to it, and I am a 1 in a million where this is a unique situation to me, there's at least 1,000 chubby Chinese guys that might see this on YouTube based on the statistics alone that might have some sort of connection to this. So really, my goal here is to get more people consulting. I think it's an incredibly invaluable experience to even, the problem solvers to see more than one environment, to move from one organization to the next, if nothing else than to see what you really enjoy doing. I think, some of us flock to, operations work or security services work where we're doing the same thing kind of over and over again without getting our feet wet in new scenarios because it's more comfortable, and we have to deal with not necessarily less bullshit, but at least the same bullshit, and we develop coping mechanisms with that bullshit, and we kind of move forward that way. So why would anybody want to do that? I've kind of made a couple of the points, but it's also another great opportunity to be very goal-oriented and project-focused, and to get yourself a real good perspective on what worked and what didn't, whether it be across projects technologically, socially, politically. And it's great for people who also try to dabble in more than one areas. And as security being a dimension of every technology in the workplace, not just countermeasures, but security as a part of development or security as a part of network engineering, you get to keep those skills up and fresh because you can go into one engagement as a network security guy and the next engagement potentially as an AppSec guy. If you can keep those skills up to that expert level on your own, what other job can you do that? You know, in an operations role or working for an enterprise, you get chartered into a role and you don't have that same flexibility. And it can be very detrimental to productive people just because they get into these ruts where they let some skills deteriorate. Why not to be a security consulting? Establishing influence, and that's kind of the theme of this talk, in an organization is either difficult or extremely difficult. Nobody walks into a room and has people listen to them because they like them, they believe them, it's not a trust issue. It's a complex thing to get somebody not only to trust you, and maybe not even to trust you, but yet still influence you in a way. And that can be a real big challenge beyond just the social. I always struck myself as kind of a likable guy outside of the office. You know, I never had any issues, you know, dealing with people or getting into the arguments, but you'll see some things here where people had started to view me not necessarily as that same problem solver that they grew to love when they threw him into the room, but now when I started to have things to say about the organization, almost as a roadblock or somebody, you know, which somebody who Jim, you know, maybe suspected I would have needed to be removed from an organization, just because you know I was getting frustrated, and through frustration comes more and more confrontation. You know, so it requires a lot of social and political awareness. And then, you know, for me, you know, when you're in an engagement, you know, I'm definitely a casual dresser. That can't always be the case as a consultant, but a lot of the times, you know, there's opportunities to relax there too. So rather than describe my background specifically, although I did a bit of that, here is what those 12 people thought of me in 2008. And this is a skills ranking off of 360 Review, which if you ever have the opportunity, you should definitely do. And I took the hard numbers out because if you saw it start with like a 1, you know, it would kind of deteriorate my point here. But, you know, at the top of here is intellectual horsepower, functional technical skills, and problem solving, which is definitely, if I had to sell myself, those would be the things I would sell myself on. And then, you know, kind of halfway through here, there's presentation skills. You guys might argue that should be a little bit lower in a few minutes. But towards the bottom is, you know, listening, action-oriented, motivating others, and customer focus. That is not how I would sell myself to an organization. And those skills being on the bottom in 2008, I think really hurt my ability to influence the organization for the better. So where did I go wrong? So this is comments from that same review that were kind of anonymized. And you know, at the first part of it, you know, every comment started off good, or at least the same way, where it's, you know, extremely talented and knowledgeable. Technical skills alone would be a towering strength. You know, Kevin's technical skills are in no way narrow. He has a significant breadth and depth in many technical topics. You see the same word being used over and over again. I got whiz kid syndrome to the highest degree. You know, I got that is what Kevin's good at. Pigeonhole box, don't listen to him on anything else. And that crippled me. And when you start to, you know, lets his nuts and bolts skill get in the way of his personal and business persona, that's why I'm not making traction. And when I saw that, it was a real eye-opener. Not that I necessarily agreed with everything in the comments, but at least I knew, you know, there's no harder data than 11 people being in the same organization and you saying they don't like you, your business and personal persona. And as a leader, I would rate him as being narrow because he focused so much of his time on the technical. I had the most technical job there. You know, I was the infrastructure architect. You know, my job was purely technical. I was given business requirements and I made technical solutions. And here they're saying he spends too much of his time essentially doing his job. That's the argument they're using to say, let's not give him any more, you know, political influence. This other one comes up quite a few times where sometimes he makes people feel inferior to his mental skills. That was one that I sort of didn't agree with, but when you start to do the kind of derivation of where that comes from, the one thing I did do is I made every argument that I could, I put it in my wheelhouse. I took people out of their comfort zone and said, okay, this is your solution to this problem, and I gave them technical facts that said why it's wrong. Now, those arguments are undoubtedly convincing, especially if you can prove from A to B that a triangle is similar to another triangle and have a very direct approach to doing that. But what it does do is make people who can't interpret that data on the same level, they're out of their wheelbox now, and now they don't really want to work with you. And not everybody has that same skill sets to take the same inputs I can and make a rational decision on. When I say, don't trust me, trust the inputs and do the work for your damn self, that takes people out of their wheelhouse, and that's really what was hurting me a lot. Moving on, he needs to be careful not to intimidate others at the same level. I think that's so a comment from two different people saying almost exactly the same thing. And this third one, while Kevin is often right, he is not going to get buy-in from others without approaching them a different way. So that's just telling me I need to look at this and what I've tried to do moving forward from there. So, that kind of led me to the conclusion that no matter how right I am, some decisions aren't mine in an organization. Influence and authority aren't granted to the person who's most correct. They're granted by the org chart and the person who has earned those positions and those influence over time based on the work they've done. Being accurate and technically adept doesn't get you very far alone. That's me. I was 100% always in my comfort zone, but I couldn't influence people and I couldn't make things better anymore. I could make things that fell 100% in my domain better, which after a year at the most, depending on the scale of what you're responsible for, web servers, you rebuild them, automated builds, go through those processes. There's only a finite amount of work to be done, and then you're at how can I influence the organization to make it better. So this is a point that's made a couple of times today that I really found, struck home with me throughout, both the talks that both Jim and Strom gave. And this last one, business leaders won't trust you until they believe that you understand the business is the driver for all decisions. And this is the point at the end of the last, we're talking about arguing with the business. And that's not the way to go. You can make a case and point out risk, but when you get into those arguments, you place people at a juxtaposition to yourself where they think that your goal is to make something arbitrarily secure. And their business is based on making money and accepting risks, and that's their decision. So you need to inform them in a way where you do not make it a confrontation always. And documentation and everything is good, but I think the way to best sell security is to be on the business's side and approach every problem and be upfront to say, hey, here's the business solution to this problem, whether it be a security problem or a business solution to anything that you're trying to architect a solution for, and say, and consistently keep those stakeholder views in line. This is something that architectural approaches have kind of formalized in the last couple of years, and one of the things that you see amongst all of them is formalizing that stakeholder view of your solution in the business architecture throughout. And once you start to drop or reduce or minimize or make it a smaller font on a slide where it says, policy, business architecture, and stuff like that, that is losing their trust that you're working for the business versus working for the love of technology, and which is something that I got kind of categorized as doing. You don't want to be the guy developing cool solutions for the sake of cool solutions. You want to be the guy that developed reasonable solutions to business problems in a very effective way. So some things that I've been doing to try to improve that in my own right, and I hope that these are relatable to some of you in projects that you work on, is when I state problems and when I go into those things, I always try to state problems with respect to the fundamental business and economic impacts as part of the project definition. And that's something that we saw earlier, that root cause picture of that person, touching that fire pan and how they're coming down to policy versus something not being hardened or something like that. What is the root cause that we're trying to solve here? The root cause is never we're trying to make a server more secure. The root cause is we're trying to protect a piece of valuable asset from threats that we know about or don't know about. Demonstrate that you understand that problems evolve from more than just bad decisions and stupidity. I found myself, looking back over the course of 5 years, I found myself calling people stupid. And it was just like, your network sucks because you were dumb in the way you built your network. And it's not the case when you look at the raw data. Things evolve. If you have a small missing skill set or a small budgetary gap, you see a small problem. I use this phrase where I see a lot of small networks that grew into big networks. That scalability issue is present in everything we do. And it's not because somebody made a conscious decision to screw it up. It's because it never became a problem until it steamrolled into a problem. And it's easy to say that people made bad decisions and to say that people neglected an issue. But sometimes it's just omission. It's just, this wasn't on our radar because it wasn't really impacting our operations. And now, although it's a steeper problem to solve, it is kind of a new problem. It's not something that was there and I decided to keep it. Always approach issues with the ability to execute on solution. Use observed problems as supporting evidence for the solution. The other thing that we tend to do when we look at a new environment or the current environment and we say that A, B, and C are screwed up, what I'm saying here is that we need to come up with our game plan to say we need to build a network without the problems of A, B, and C. And you'll be surprised how much easier it is to sell just by changing the way you're phrasing the same thing and not focusing on the problems of... You want to use the problems as existing as supporting arguments for something that you're trying to do. Just harping on what's failed, that doesn't get your company anywhere, and that doesn't get you influence within an organization. That gets you tagged as somebody who's not playing the game for the company. That's, you're pointing out issues. Sometimes you may not have the expertise to come to something with a solution, and you need to engage the people in a very teamwork-oriented fashion. When I say, you need to engage the people that are responsible for the solution or who can help you develop the solution. Outside of you're putting them on the line for the problems. You need to work your back channels and even your forward channels and say, hey, this is the argument. I'm not sure about the solution but maybe here's a solution, but how can we work together? I do recognize these problems and I can quantify these problems for you, but what's the next steps of execution? Just stay very execution focused. I think a lot of people fail because they spend 2 years complaining about something, and then when they finally have a good idea to fix something, they've already lost that influence because all they've been doing is complaining or deciding that other things were inferior, whether it be within their responsibility or not. Understand how you engage and leverage that. This is a specific consulting thing. Where when you're going into an organization, somebody has decided at some level that you need to be there. Now, this may be tougher if you have an awesome sales guy, but I think for me, what I do is I try to have that background of what was the missing skill set, or what was was there a breach that led me to this, or what was the chain of events that got me in the door at that client. And you use that to establish your influence. So if they needed somebody who could develop, a security architecture practice based on their security policy, guess what? I'm a security architecture practice architect development expert. You use that as the position of influence where I have this skill set that you're missing. Let me work with your organization to resolve it. That's an easy in the doorway to establish good influence if you do it right. Now, that can be hard also when you're put in a position where the reason you're there may not match up 100% to the skill set that you have. I think you still need to try to use the influence, but then also, like any situation, we learn working out of our box, and I understand that you're going to be on some projects that require amount of learning, and that can make it harder to establish the influence thing naturally. But, smart people need to get ahead of it enough where, hey, I can still be trusted to figure this out and approach it in that way. Look for organizational gaps that you can help bridge as an outsider. I go to places where they have really much smarter people than me there that could fix the problem much better than I could. The reason they can is because it's outside of their organizational charter to do so. They're upset about it. They get frustrated. They fall into the same level of not having enough influence, or a position where it takes two groups to solve something, and they can't work effectively with each other anymore. I see countless, I think 5 out of 6 organizations that I go to seem to have this natural issue where they have an awesome or a very quality network architecture group, very quality network engineering group, very good network or security engineering group that's doing operations work as firewalls, but they don't have a network security architect. And as a result, their firewall architecture and their countermeasure architecture is just added on to it. It's in the wrong places. They're not being able to get data out of it effectively, and it's because the packet pushing guys did not care about the design of security within their group, and the security engineering guy didn't have influence, perhaps expertise, and perhaps just that organizational charter or that professional role to say, I have the authority to make changes and compromises in the network architecture in order to facilitate security. And if you don't do that, for network and security people out there, you either have a really awesome insecure network or a really secure, poorly functioning network. One of the two, or both. Some way you can get both. I mean, it's just those organizational gaps a lot of the times are easier to bridge as an outsider that say, hey, I'm not chartered to any one specific group. I'm chartered to this problem. And then you can work with people individually, understand each individual's groups and roles, charters, problems, day-to-day pains, establish influence with each one, and it's a lot easier as an outsider sometimes to bridge those gaps. So you should do it, A, because it's valuable to the company, B, because it's usually the best way to solve your problems, and C, it establishes influence. If you can get something done because of that, sum is greater than the whole type of issues where individual pieces are there, but they cannot work together. A consultant can do that, and it's a great way to establish influence. Look for easy tactical wins too. So the best thing we do, technology-wise, is we recognize that something is simply misconfigured or whatever in the course of, even if that's not your chartered goal for your project, call those out, not as a problem, and definitely use the rule of saying, hey, this would work better. I've seen 10 organizations the last year that had the same issue. You should try to do it this way. If it's an easy tactical win where you can solve somebody's life, even if it's outside of what you're there to do, use that back channel and sell that. Great way to establish influence with people. And you have the opportunity to have seen it done in 20 different places versus seen it done maybe once or twice in the career of an average operations network engineer who's not moving from project to project or something like that. Those wins are really valuable for people in terms of process or whatever. And they're there too. People try to say, lean on the sides of strategy 100% over tactics, but tactics are something that we know by heart are easy wins. As consultants, we see them a lot. Sell them, sell them to your customer in the sense of, don't sell them for dollars so much if it's a 1-hour thing, but sell it in terms of, I'm buying influence with the organization in order to get my project work done, and then to sell additional work going there. Showstoppers on influence. This is coming 100% from me, and why I think I stopped having influence in that organization. One is perceived arrogance. When I made people uncomfortable taking me out of their wheelhouse, they said, well, Kevin's trying to be smarter than me. The second one is actual arrogance. You see this from time to time. I may have... It's difficult to get a reflection of that on any one of us, and that's why I don't talk about myself so much as I presented the here's what 12 people had to say about me thing, and that would lead you to believe that regardless of whether or not I felt like I was being arrogant, people perceived me as arrogant, and that's the problem on influence. 2 is not listening and not seeking out input from the right people. I saw problems in other organizations, and I saw, solutions and stuff like that. But when you don't listen, when you're discussing something with something, regardless of whether or not you care with your opinion, the way to get past the argument is to listen completely to their argument. Whether or not it's right or wrong, just listening to their argument, you find out really if it's true or correct. Take the person out of the picture. Even people you don't like can come up with good ideas sometimes. And if you get into that position where you don't listen to somebody because of who they are, you're setting yourself up for failure on a lot of different levels. So get past that and listen to people. 2, if you take the time to listen to people, they will take the time. It's a very psychological thing. They will a lot of times take the time to listen to you. And at least even if you don't arrive to 100% agreement, they feel comfortable that a full exchange of ideas has taken place. And that gets you past a lot of arguments, whether you're right or wrong, or whether you think they're right or wrong. Fourth one, if you catch yourself doing this, you're in a rut where you see people say, you don't understand this issue. And just stuff like flat out, you're wrong. That's when it's time to take a step back from this argument, because we're not doing anything productive at that point. There's other ways to phrase this where it's like you don't understand the idea of risk, like I do. That's just saying that we have 2 different views on risk. I have the right view and you have the wrong view. Those things don't work for people, and it just automatically escalates the issue into a personal issue from a professional issue. And man, does that kill whatever you're trying to do. 5 is getting frustrated in general. We all get frustrated. We all get visibly frustrated. The parts about getting frustrated that lead into loss of influence is when you get emotionally frustrated in front of people about things that aren't 100%, or about anything really, but sometimes we do this over silly things, where it's just like, maybe a policy or procedure that you don't 100% agree with. Maybe somebody said you don't understand, or you're wrong, and you start to get those frustrations. Nothing good comes from it. So you got to maintain some emotional distance, in the sense that you still want to care about your projects and your quality of the work, but when you start to get frustrated and you start to take a lot of it home, you never get better from that. It's just kind of seems to add up, or at least for me it did. Saying something is policy when it isn't. Man, this is kind of outside. This is more, and this is applicable to even when you're working with customers and stuff like that, like not just with your peers trying to solve problems. But when you suggest a solution to somebody and they say it's against the policy and there's no policy related to that, man, I don't want to talk to that guy ever again. Like that is a thing that kills me. And I've stopped people, I've managed teams, and I've seen it almost get to that, where it's like they come back to me and say, I got this ticket request. I told them that we don't do this. I'm like, well, we haven't done it. We still need to have the full discussion of whether or not it's the right thing to do. And when you say that it's against policy, the next time you try to enforce something that really is policy, or the next time you try to make something policy, you've lost ground already by saying something was policy off the top of your head, just to use it almost as a mechanic to end a ticket or end a conversation. So, our policies are very valuable, as I think Jim did a great job of pointing out in the last talk. Don't minimize it, just because you think people haven't read the full policy, which I think users, way high percentage of them have never read the formal security policy for an organization. I've worked at organizations as a security engineer, and I know a lot of people did not read the security policies even within IT security. So avoid that outside. If you take one thing away from this, and I hope that it's not limited to that, but this is applicable across the board. Don't say something policy unless it's written down as actual policy that has been instituted. And half the times maybe policy isn't the best way. I mean, it is an important goal, but a lot of our policies are in kind of a failed point. And this kind of emphasizes things that are failed. If there's something important that isn't in the policy, don't just say it's policy. Go and try to make it policy. And then we kind of talked about this already, is just getting too focused on the problems versus the solutions. Problems are an easy way sometimes to sell security, or at least to sell the problem of security, but not so much the work of security. I mean, if you go and you say that 25 things are wrong, the first thing a business guy is going to say is, well, what's right? How do we execute from here? Where do we go next? Give me a project plan. Give me a to-do list. And that if you don't do that, and if you instead come back to him with 10 more problems the next week without having produced that to-do list or that action list, man, you're not going to get very far the next week either. So these are just kind of reflections overall. Is the exact same skills that got me to one level in my career, up until essentially the infrastructure architect level. I had been a systems engineer, a network engineer, and kind of crossing over between the two for several years. Got more into developing architectures and ended up as kind of an infrastructure architect for a significant amount of time. The exact same skills that got me up to that level stopped me from moving past that level. Because it was all these are the tech problems, this is the tech solution. And I was able to, and it helped in a lot of ways to say, I know the best way to solve this problem with the tools I had on hand. Let me work within those tools and just get the job done really fast and really move forward. You can't you can't establish influence really fast with people like that. And when I stopped trying to establish influence with people, the tech stuff didn't matter. I was whiz kid syndrome, where it's just like, well, I don't want him to sit I never had a seat at the board table. I don't want him in this meeting, but I want him to be the owner of these 25 tasks to get the job done. You fall into that category where you have very little influence on what you end up doing. Your influence is based on how other people perceive you. We see security experts, everybody falls into the category of we have this notion of who we are ourselves, and that's great, and that's an identity for you, but that's not your identity in the world. You have to get feedback in some way. And I tell you what, your boss's feedback usually sucks, because he's got a very narrow scope. He or she has a very narrow scope of what you're doing. He has the scope of, here you're this good of an employee to me in my capacity to do my job. He doesn't see how you interact with customers, your peers, how you solve problems, how you work through issues. He sees maybe some metric of what you did, but primarily how fast you got your timesheets back to him, which, it's great to be a good timesheet submitter and get those in on time, but it's probably not something you'd put on the top 10 list of accomplishments for a week in terms of actually moving forward. So you really need to have some opportunity. If you want to make a course correction, the first thing you need to figure out is how far off course you are and in what ways. And that, for me, was this 360 review process. And I recommend, if you ever have the opportunity to work someplace or work with the same colleagues long enough to get something like that done, seek it out formally, informally. If it's a conversation where, in some ways you can get maybe 3 Jim Beams in and have that real talk. Have that talk. Any feedback that you can get on how you're perceived from other people, that's not a perspective by definition you can have yourself without soliciting it. And it is your true identity in the workplace and across the board. The third one is we have an advantage here. It's much easier for us to work on these things, make these course corrections, and develop the soft skills required to get influence than it is for salesmen to become technical experts, because we've been doing this as a passion for however long we've been doing it as a passion. People sell sometimes as a passion, usually to make money, but those same people, kind of mutually exclusive, have no tolerance for the nuts and bolts game of what we do. By and large. So I guess there's exceptions to every rule, but my point here is that we have to do 5 things. Keep things on the top of our mind to work through these issues, establishing influence. They would have to do hard research, learn mechanics of things, and then maybe they fall into the same traps, regardless of getting the technical skills and building on that foundation of knowledge that we take to our jobs. You don't need to be perfect. I'm not suggesting that anybody could be or that I think I am. What I do think that I have done in the last year is tried to be more reflective on what I've been doing and come away from engagements not so much I did X, but I did X in this way and I felt it was this effective. Here's where I stumbled. Here's people that walked, when I come away from the engagement and it's clear that I have ruffled a feather, how and why did I ruffle it? Sometimes maybe I think it's unavoidable to get to point X, but you do have to assess the path, the critical, not just the critical path of getting the work done, but the complete view of a project in reflection and your career in reflection to start trying to figure out if perhaps you have some issue that you can go, build your own data and review that data and stay reflective on it regardless of what you do. And the last thing is if you don't do that and you can't make progress because you don't have influence or you can't make progress for something else, you're not going to be happy no matter how cool your job starts off to be. If you're not working outside of your box, developing new skills, getting new things done, progressing in some way, you're going to get frustrated. You're going to start to suck at the same job that you loved, and then it's just going to go downhill. And you see some people, for some people, perhaps I fall into this category, a couple of years of doing any one role, I feel like I've gotten to that point, which is why consulting is a very good, refreshing, be able to move and keep some of that out of there. But progress is important to our happiness, and it's, if you think you can take one job and be happy for 25 years, you're a unique individual. I can't, we need to keep progress and have that ambition, and I think it's a big part of happiness is to be able to get to the next level there. Is it working for me? Unfortunately, after I did that and had that reflective moment, or fortunately, I decided, hey, this would be a great opportunity after I've learned some of the new soft skills to go back to consulting. I had been a consultant in 2000 to 2003, but more of a, in those days, there was enough people building stuff that you could be kind of the build guy, go in just on engagements and build something. I didn't really establish influence with anybody except for the fact that it's like, wow, he built the shit out of that network. Let's bring him back to build something else. Never really had any influence there, but decided to go back to more of a strategic consulting, understand the evolution of issues and stuff like that, and try to make some real changes after I kind of had this reflection of part of the reason why I got out of consulting in the first place. But yeah, I think it's working. 6 months after that review, before I left that position, I had already received a lot of positive feedback, unsolicited, from people that didn't even take the same review, saying, hey, I don't know what happened to Kevin, but all of a sudden he's trying to solve my problems versus trying to stop me from doing what I wanted to do. That's a big shift. It's essentially the same thing from what I was trying to do perspective-wise, but I had given him a new perspective on what I was trying to do. Instead of saying no and being the chief officer of no, go screw yourselves, that's going to compromise their security in some way, I said, what are you trying to do? Can I work with, understand the root of how that conversation, because we always get the last subset of somebody wants to open up SQL to the internet. And it's like, no, that's a crazy idea. But instead of saying, no, that's a crazy idea, go fuck yourself, we have to say, whoa, what is the dependency on that? Keep going back, fold back the layers, and when it gets down to it, it's usually something that you have a better suggestion for, that you can make that tactical win, much better off with everybody. You maintain more influence, you keep people happy, people see you as a problem solver versus a chief officer of no, go fuck yourself. Big win. So yeah, and I feel like walking away from projects in the last 8 months, I feel like I have had, when I have left, I have changed something more than the project work I've done. I've made some sort of impact on that business, and whether or not that's just bullshit or not, I feel like I'm influencing decisions and organizations in a way that I wasn't able to do strictly from, and I'm doing it with my technology experience, and I'm doing it in a way that's going to benefit most directly their technology and their infrastructure and their architecture, but it's just I'm being listened to now, and that's new for me, So I think that's pretty much everything I had on the list, so if there's any questions or anything. Thank you.
question.
I went over here.
Thank you. I came in a little late, so possibly I missed like a beginning thesis, but you made a statement about how you don't want to be the guy doing the cool stuff, making the cool things in the cool room. You want to do the reasonable thing, but sometimes might you want to be the cool guy making the cool stuff? I don't know. I want to make cool stuff.
Yeah, I absolutely. I'm still in this, but I love technology. I mean, if it were up to me, every other project I did, it would be some sort of infrastructure build and stuff like that. So I do love the nuts and bolts of it as much as the next guy. But from a career perspective, and from an overall happiness perspective, it's hard to be the guy doing the cool stuff without doing the cool stuff over and over again until it becomes not cool stuff. I want to be the guy that moves on to the next problem I can solve. And I found it very hard to do that just by being able to do cool stuff really well. I had to develop a new set of skills to get me to the next bit of new cool stuff. And that's where I couldn't do it. Yep.
So first off, good job. It takes a lot of guts to come up here and say, "Look, I failed. Look, this is what I did that failed." So good on that. But a comment on something you had earlier was that you're trying to get lots of feedback from different people, and you're trying to find out what's going on and what's going wrong. You have to be careful with that, because that can kind of fail on you too. You can change your perception, because I did that for a little bit and I learned that was a mistake. You have to be very skillful and selective in the way you look for your feedback.
I would disagree. I agree with the sentiment of the point, but I would say that all feedback is helpful. What you need to do is improve the way you can analyze feedback. And you need to be able to take feedback. This guy hates me, is not in and of itself useful feedback to you, so you may be tempted to avoid that feedback. But if you get it and you look at it with a better perspective and a better lens of what were your actions that created that effect, regardless of whether or not you agree with the effect, it doesn't matter. But you should always be looking at and being honest with yourself enough, and if you need another perspective of it, hopefully you have colleagues and trusted people. And to me, my friends are a good sounding board when it comes to the point of they don't know shit about Unix, Linux, anything, but what they are good at is they know me, and they know what I could have possibly done to make him say something that I thought was inaccurate or something like that. So I think as much feedback as possible is good, but we do have to be very careful about how we look at our data in that respect. And there's obviously stuff in this packet. Once you get to a certain point and people think that you're not good at customer service, there's going to be comments in there that, he doesn't get my customers, not true things that have come from my losing influence with them and my affecting them in a way to start. So I think as much feedback as possible is good. Be careful in what you're doing with that feedback and how, the changing what you're doing based on feedback, those need to be very analyzed and you need to be very strategic. And you need to be scientific in the sense where you don't want to change a whole bunch of things at once. You need to work on something, see how it's improving it, hold those variables steady. You're not going to solve every problem you have on a political or social level overnight. You need to, make a theory based on some data, make some sort of metric to figure out how you're going to determine, how are you going to recognize that if it's helping or not, and then execute on your plan. If it doesn't improve anything, and you don't like saying sorry or whatever it was that you decided to change from a behavior standpoint, revert it and look for a new solution that's going to work better for you.
Hi. One thing I noticed is that over the various companies I work for is that there's a big gap between, the business people and the tech people. Actually, that's why I made a decision to, a few years back to go back to school and to get a business degree, because I noticed that we couldn't talk the same language. And I completely agree in your presentation. You said that we as techs should try to talk to business people at their level and to meet their needs. But in your opinion, what do you think? Are we really trying hard enough? Because I still, over the years, I have seen that many of us don't try to go that level, and we kind of protect our own domain instead of trying to get to their side.
I see that exact same problem. I think the problem itself is over-exaggerated. I think that's an easy way for both business and occasionally tech people fall into it where they're saying, the business is saying, well, tech doesn't understand what we're trying to do from a strategy perspective. And then what that is that's the loss of influence technology has on the business people. Not business itself, not what we're trying to do, because that's driven by the business people. But the business people want to listen to tech in what they're good at, which is technology and solving business problems with technology, because you've already lost that influence. And that, I think, the problem itself, I'm not a business, I'm not a sales expert. I understand the fundamental principles of accounting and some, but that's not my expertise. But I do work outside of my box enough to try to say, I understand the objective. I mean, the objective here is to make money, to get new customers, to reach out, to solve a roaming user, to solve that problem of remote users. Those are very easy things to understand, and I think 99% of the things we're doing are very simple to understand. The parts that are required for technology to understand what the business is doing. The reason that we come to that butting of heads and the business people saying, fuck technology, those assholes don't listen to us, is because we've, on both sides, exaggerated that problem. We exaggerate it because we don't want to deal with it. So, somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'm trying to improve sales in this one way. Right off the bat, you're like, don't fucking tell me what you're trying to do on the business side. That's not my area of expertise. I code these lines and I develop these firewall policies. We're extending that gap ourselves, and we're trying to minimize the amount of inputs that we need, and we don't listen to it. And then they have the perfect opportunity to say, you know what? We're the ones making money. You're a cost center. We haven't had a security breach in 10 years. We don't know if you're doing your job or not, frankly, and we don't have the knowledge and expertise to examine it carefully. So that's when you start to see the real business versus technology problem. And I have had a boss go on a panel and make an argument like that, and the first thing that I'm at fault for saying that I don't understand the business as much as they're at fault for saying I don't understand the business, even when I think I understood enough of the business to do my job appropriately. Oh, whatever.
Start in the back.
All right. Yeah, to your point, I think one of the more valuable things I've done the last few years as an IT person, consulting and whatnot, was taking a financial accounting class. And that really helped me understand that there are only a few fundamental things that businesses do as actually engage in. They basically try to take resources, add value to them, and turn a profit. And what we do is mostly an externality. They aren't in the business of making their own carbon paper. They don't even want to buy, office supplies. They don't want routers. They don't want to maintain a network. They just want to sell shit or mine coal or whatever it is they do and sell it as fast as possible and get rid of it.
Yeah, I agree with that in terms of you should expand general foundational business understanding because it's easy to do. I think another thing is, the most important thing is to understand what your business is. Like, I understand accounting, that's great. I understand, accounting.com or whatever business I work for much better and much easier, easy to do still at a lot of levels of getting to, they can, just like we can distill security to, ultimately, maybe Saltzer's 1975 paper that has 8, design principles of security. If you look in there, it's hard to comment on a situation that doesn't fall into one of those gaps. You get that same set of business principles from whoever wrote the 1901 paper on business. I don't know who it is because I haven't read it. John Locke, perhaps, but you get that same perspective on the business side, and I think you're in a good position to execute on the technology end of it. I feel like that gap has been exaggerated on both ends because we didn't want to deal with the bullshit of business, and they didn't want to, and they extend the gap to say that you're not executing for us appropriately. And
I feel like I can't offer the right technology if I don't understand the motivations for what they're actually trying to do in the end.
Yeah, that sometimes they come to you with a partial solution, which is definitely a sign where it's a sign that they don't trust you to come up with the solution on your own. So they say, hey, we want to deploy Citrix for these 1,000 users. They don't come to you with the requirement of saying, hey, we need this app to work remotely for our users. And that's also a sign of you having lost influence and trust with an organization when you start to see those partial solutions roll in. Because they don't think maybe you're agile enough to get, execute on a plan or something. They try to start it at a point that's 9/10 of the way down the line in architecture development and say, hey, deal with this. It might be right, might not be right. This is what the business demands of you. I think we fall into that gap because we've already lost the influence there.
Another question. What resources have you found to be useful in addressing the problems you mentioned of developing appropriate levels of influence without sort of getting the sand kicked in your face, so that you can deliver useful solutions but actually get them to listen to those solutions? Are there websites, are there books, are there associations? What are you doing, and where do you find the resources to get you there?
There are, for me, that's why I'm consulting right now, is because I now, establishing influence is a very difficult thing to do. If we take an operations role, we're going to be at a company for a year, you might have a couple months to determine whether or not you're going to have influence over the next 2 years or not. In a consulting role, we do that per project, right? We go in and we maybe have a week or two to establish influence or not, and we build on that in a very iterative approach, just like we build on our other skills. But I've mostly been doing it from a skills perspective and reflection. I haven't pursued, and there's probably some good resources out there to look at. I haven't pursued, I haven't read any books on how to establish influence from the perspective of technology. One of the reasons that I wanted to do this talk is because I felt just instinctively that there wasn't a lot of people having this discussion.
So I work for a company that actually mandates 360s every 6 months.
You work for an awesome company in that respect.
It can be. It can also not be. One of the things you bring up is that the people that you surveyed, you've worked with for a great deal of time.
Yes.
When you've worked with someone for 6 months and they're writing a review on you, this can sometimes be skewed by what you've brought in when you come into an environment in the first place. You mentioned something where it's not often where people are intentionally making bad choices. They make a bad choice that simply evolves and grows into a much worse choice.
To clarify, I think sometimes choices are left unmade. And that's my that's my major point on that point, is that sometimes people do not make a conscious decision for something to turn into what it became. And when we say that they did, when we say that this person is responsible for the network and the network sucks, therefore they've decided to have a bad network, we fall into one of the issues that I'm talking about.
Well, no, but I think it's also fair to criticize them for not making a choice in the first place. Not having the insight to make a proper architecture is just as bad, at least in my opinion, as making a blatant choice to make the network worse than it needs to be.
Right, but I don't disagree with the point that it's fair. I disagree with the point that it's productive. And in our professional careers, the one thing we should strive to do is be as productive as possible, I feel. I mean, okay. Yes, I think when in drinking with your friends and stuff like that, you can say, man, look at what this asshole did at the end of the day. It's good to digest, and maybe that kind of curbs your frustration factor a little bit, venting through that. But there's no time machine in that network architecture. So come to that with the approach of, this network architecture can be improved by establishing, tiers or whatever the problem is. Here's why I think it has. Here's 7 outage examples of different problems that cause because you have one server connected to 8 networks and no network topology, essentially. Those problems, use them as evidence of your solution, or suggest that there is a better solution out there. I wouldn't, Tim's a jerk because he designed a bad network. I don't think it's going to get you very far.
Well, no, that wasn't really where I was going.
I understand. I'm being hyperbolic. I'm taking what you said and being hyperbolic to prove a point. But I do understand what you're saying. And I
the only question I would have in this case, and maybe you have some insight into this, I work for a team of people who, in some cases, have a very limited depth and background, and they're being put into areas where they're making a great deal of choices. I find that I have a much wider background than most of them do. In many cases, I cannot get them to listen to ideas because they do not have the technical depth to understand the idea that I am posing. In this case, it is often given that my organization is with bad reputation inside our entire organization. Do you have any advice on kind of working within a large organization at odds with your team to make a good influence on another organization?
Well, the one thing that jumps out at me, and I don't have a solution to everybody's problem, the one thing that jumps out at me on that whole thing is that we're assuming that they're not listening to you because they don't have the knowledge to know you're right. The reason I think they're not listening to you is because they don't feel you have any, they don't know that you're right because they don't have that foundational knowledge, and you haven't established trust and influence for them to trust that you're right. That's a much harder thing to do because you can't make that on paper argument of A then B then C then D. You have to work with them over time take a very upfront approach to develop, working with them to develop the required skills that you think that are necessary to understand your arguments at first. But I would say that there are situations where somebody has no idea that the decision I've made is right, but they can take what I have contributed to that. My job was to offer my opinion on that, and they can trust that opinion whether or not they have the nuts and bolts behind it to know that I was right. And that's what I've been working on improving. Not so much, the education factor is huge. If these people are in technical roles, they need to start building those educations. Going way back to the very first question you had, the part about this every 6 months feedback and it being sometimes not useful to you, that knowing what's useful and what's not is that discriminatory eye. I think it's great that, although it could be very time consuming, maybe 6 months is not a great time interval, maybe something like a year or something like that, but I think it is good from the sense that you get a lot of data, you can kind of pick and choose what to do with it. Eventually, if somebody has been there for 5 years and you've been there for 5 years, their data is going to start to be valuable to you, more than somebody who, I don't know, doesn't like you for some prejudicial reason or anything else. Yep.
All right, so I've been freelancing for about a year, and I would say in the last month I started getting bites. The only reason for that, I think, is because I switched from, I think this to go back to the concept of influence, where I think that sort of has tendrils that can reach out to different things. Like influence could entirely depend on verbiage used and language used in communication, where A equals 1, B equals 2, stuff like that, where if you tell somebody, yeah, you're running a Cisco with a 10 base T Ethernet interface, and you're plugging into a giggy port with 400,000 people on the other side, you're going to have trouble. Where it's translating that to something like, you're not using the right equipment, here's what you should be using, and provide a link or something like that. It's a whole different, this is night and day. Right. So I want to know what your thoughts were on basically giving away a ton of free work. Because, if you value your time, like I bill at X dollars an hour, how many hours do I spend giving away free work as opposed, right. I'm spending my time essentially getting nothing. It's sort of like a fish hook in the water. Like, for example, my exact scenario is I didn't start getting any bites at all until I put a video on YouTube of how to exploit an XP2 host from an iPod using Metasploit. And all of a sudden everybody wants to talk to me. Yeah, I think, and I touched on this briefly, but in a lot of situations we have to trade tactical improvements for influence. And whether or not you can, as far as the billing's concerned, if they're a 1 hour, 2 hour thing, if you're already engaged on a project with them, it's one thing to just kind of lump that into the work you're doing or something like that. To be able to help, that's a lot more valuable to them to be able to help, and may not be able. But once you try to go through, developing a SAO to say, that's not what people want. People want, hey, here's a very quick tactical improvement, and you're exchanging that for influence. And I wouldn't say it's giving away your time. You're upping the odds of you being successful in other opportunities by a lot. So when it starts get to, if it's a re-architecture or something like that, you got to look at other ways to sell the work you're going to do and figure out things. But I think at one level, there's a lot of situations where it boils down to 1 or 2 hours of tactical commentary or something like that. And I think that's a good way to get ahead in the game of quickly establishing influence with people. If you're willing to give that your experience to a situation that you see happening tangential to what you're doing, and that helps them, then they look at you as somebody to trust solving problems.
Actually, we need to end the tape here, so if everybody claps.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.